Hello brewers and lab nerds! Today we're going to go over color formation and how to control it, and more precisely 10 ways of producing the lightest colored beer possible. So if you want to make, let's say, a light colored saison, pilsner or triple, you want to be able to control the color that you're going to have in the beer, and there's many different variables. I'm going to go over the 10 biggest ones. The 10 different items are going to be raw materials, oxidation, milling, mashing, lauter temperature, wort boiling, the fermentation, filtration, bottling, and pasteurization. So let's start with raw materials. That's the biggest section. The malt selection is, of course, the biggest one. You need to start with a pale malt, like a pilsner that has a very low EBC rating. Now, as far as the malt go, you also want to look at the protein levels in the specific malt. If you have a protein level that's lower, you can decrease the EBC of the final beer by as much as 0.3. That is comparing a 12.5% protein to a 10.2. You also want to look for the level of modification. If you have less modification, you also get a lighter colored beer, as much as 0.4% EBC difference. You find the level of modification by looking at the soluble nitrogen or the Kolbach index, depending on if you're in Europe or where you are. Next, for raw materials, you want to look at hops. Hops have a lot of polyphenols in them, and they are precursors, and when they oxidize, they can produce the precursors for color substances. So you want to look for hops with less polyphenols or using less hops. That can reduce the color of the final beer by as much as 1.75 EBC. You also want to use fresh hops over hops that's already been oxidized. That can decrease the color as much as 1.45 EBC. Then in brewing water, this is very important. If you have a low pH, it inhibits melanoidin production. So if you're producing a low colored beer, you want to have a pH in your mash about 5.1 to 5.2. Any higher and you will have more melanoidin production. A low pH also lowers the extractions of tannins, and tannins also bring the color up of the final beer. Last thing, for brewing water, use calcium sulfate to lighten the color. So if you add more calcium sulfate, you lower the residual alkalinity, and you can decrease the color of the final beer by as much as 1.1 EBC. Last, for raw materials, is the use of adjuncts, such as sugar. If you don't use any adjuncts at all and you do everything perfect throughout the fermentation or the brewing process, you can end up with a beer at the lowest of 5 EBC. If you use adjuncts such as sugar, using sugar up to 15% or using corn or rice, you can decrease the color of the final beer down to as low as 2.5. Now, I'm not saying that you want to have that in a beer, but that is one way to decrease the color. All right, so that was raw materials. Number 2 is oxygenation or oxidation. You want to stay away from oxidation at all portions of brewing, and that includes when you stir the mash. You don't want to splash it around. You also want to make sure you don't splash as you're adding or siphoning from your fermenter into a bottling bucket or a bright tank. Always minimize it. Same goes for filtering and of course bottling, which we'll get to later. What happens is you'll have polyphenols that will polymerize, and that is a precursor to color. Next, 3, milling. If you have a coarse grind, you will not crush so many of the husks, and by doing that you're going to have less tannins in the solution, again the precursor for color. Another is, if you do have a fine grind, if you have to have one, you have to be really careful about not picking up oxygen. You have more surface area now, so more oxygen can more easily be picked up. Next, mashing. The less intense mash program you have, the lower the EBC. So if you were to do a triple decoction, it makes sense that you're going to have some Maillard reactions and you will end up with a darker wort. So by having a more simple either infusion or one decoction, you can decrease the color of your final beer by 1.5 EBC. The lauter temperature. When you're finally doing your lautering, your sparging, you want to have a temperature of about 78 degrees Celsius. The reason is that the optimum temperature for phenol oxidase enzyme is 72 degrees. So we want to go higher than that to deactivate it. That can decrease your color by 1 EBC. Next, wort boiling. Of course, a shorter wort is not going to produce as many color, as much color in your wort as if you were to boil it for a long period of time. That is a method you can use for darkening your wort. So if you're trying as much as you can to produce a light colored wort, then a shorter boil would be good. Of course, if you have all Pilsen, you might want to weigh that against the getting rid of the MMS for the, so you don't have the precursor for off flavors. So what if you boil 30 minutes, then that will produce, or excuse me, 1 hour, that will produce a 1.6 EBC color less than if you were to boil the wort for 2 hours. Also, you want to cool that wort really quickly afterwards. If you cool it in 30 minutes, it will have a 0.6 EBC difference than if you were to cool the whole wort over 90 minutes. Then fermentation. Throughout fermentation, that's the only time you have a drop in the color. So that's because the pH is dropping at that point. And you can have an even higher drop if you select the right yeast. So try out different yeast, divide your wort into 3-4 different fermenters and pitch a different yeast in each one, label them well, and then do some testing of the color of the final beer afterwards to find out which one works best for you, which one gets the lowest EBC. Next, number 8 is filtration. Normally, filtration will not lower the color of a beer. However, if you use active carbon filtering, that can lower the color some. Also, if you do fiber or sheet filtration or sterile filtration, that can have a slight reduction in the color, but not a lot. Normal filtration will not decrease the color at all. Then we come to bottling, number 9. Try to, again, minimize the oxygen pickup through bottling. So when you bottle, make sure you get rid of all the oxygen that's in the bottle before you fill beer, and of course fill it from the bottom up. If there's any oxygen in there and you're splashing, you're gonna oxidize your beer. The last one, number 10, is pasteurization. If you are gonna be pasteurizing your beer to increase the shelf life, then you have 2 different options. You can either flash pasteurize or you can tunnel pasteurize your beer. Flash pasteurizing your beer gives very little flavor or color to the beer because it's going to be heated up for a short period of time. However, if you tunnel pasteurize your beer, you have a lot longer exposure to higher temperature and therefore can increase the color of your final beer a little bit. That is it. So even if you're not trying to produce a light colored beer, at least you now know the different variables that do affect the final color of your beer. So that's really it. If you have any questions, please fill in the comments section below. Please subscribe to the channel, and cheers!